Welcome back to the Brittany Hughes Show, everybody. My guest today with us is Gardner Goldsmith. I'm going to try to get through all of this, okay? Gard is a scriptwriter. He is a journalist. He is a syndicated radio host. He is a lecturer on political economics, and he also writes for MRC-TV, and he focuses largely on government regulations and overreach, which is why he's here today. I summarized that. That's not all what he does, but Gard, quite frankly, your resume is too long, and I don't have long enough to read the whole dang thing on this podcast. You do too many things, my friend. You need to scale it back, make it easier for people like me. But he is on today, and I asked him to come on this show because he has written a fascinating piece that you can find over at MRC-TV. And again, with dealing with government regulations and government overreach and government spending and all the ways that the government screws us every single day, it feels like oftentimes when we don't even know it. He has a whole lot that keeps him busy. And I think sometimes some of these stories that are really massive and have major implications on Americans and their daily lives sometimes end up falling through the cracks, even though they are probably some of the most important things that we should be talking about. So Gard, first of all, thank you for coming on the podcast. It's good to see you, buddy.
It's great to see you, Brittany. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate it. And thanks for the kind words about the piece, too. Coming from a person who does the great work you do, that makes me feel great. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, this new one was fascinating to me as I was reading it, and it's a bit of a lengthy piece, but it is so incredibly important. And it's about a new proposed government regulation, and I want to get that correct, right? It's a proposed government regulation. A lot of times these things do end up getting shoved through. There is a process that they go through. We're going to talk about a little bit of that process later on in the show because I think that's an important piece here. But this is not something that has been enacted yet. This is still in the proposal aspect of things, but it is particularly focused on boating. Can you explain a little bit what this new regulation would do if, in fact, it's passed?
Absolutely. And thanks for paying attention to this because it's going to affect so many people almost all the way up the eastern seaboard of the United States, from the tip of Florida to the northern coast of Massachusetts. And it's under, of course, the wonderful euphemism of regulation, which, of course, is really just a government threat against innocent people who just want to be left alone. But it comes under the Department of Commerce, which is working through the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, and have a good time looking for that in the U.S. Constitution. So what they proposed started last year in August. And basically, they gave people 2 months to find out about it, and then, of course, get their comments in, which, generally speaking, really make no difference whatsoever. They're just required to have a commentary period, and then they'll go forward with whatever they want. And what they're going to do is they're going to impose a 10-knot speed limit on the oceans between Florida and the northern coast of Massachusetts. I don't know why New Hampshire and Maine are not part of it, but they're not. And that will extend to 100 miles off the coast. Now, the area over which the U.S. government traditionally handled the oceans, and this isn't even in the Constitution, it's just what they claimed, was 12 miles before you got to international waters. Then in 1999, the Clinton administration changed that to 24 miles, 24 nautical miles off the coast. This is 100 miles, and that's just the practicality of it. There's so much more regarding the economics and so on, that this is a big red flag for so many people and their livelihoods all the way up the coast of the eastern seaboard.
So there are several problems with this, and I want to get into it because, again, for the vast majority of people, this might kind of be something that just sort of slides under the radar and we don't think about. Problem number one, and this is an underlying issue. This is something that I think undergirds so many of these regulations that we see through all of these agencies and all of these departments. Problem number one is the fundamental problem of this being a government regulation in an area where the government does not actually have any constitutional purview. This is not something that the government should be involved in the first place, at least on a federal level. And so that's kind of issue number one, right? We have all of these agencies, we have all of these bureaucracies, all of these departments that have their hands in all of this stuff that the Constitution never actually enumerates that power to the federal government. Is this just, I mean, this is just one example out of, I mean, how many in a year could we count of regulations that get shoved through that really have nothing to do with what the federal government was set up to do as established by the founders, correct?
Yeah, precisely, Brittany. And, a lot of people will say, well, let's look at this policy and see where it's going wrong. Let's see, is the area of coverage the bad idea? Is the speed limit the bad idea? No, the bad idea is that they are assuming power in an area where they have no legitimate constitutional power. If they would like to operate in some other way, they can amend the Constitution. And if they are going to do that, and the politicians are supportive of that, then what would those politicians say, a senator or a congressman, if they found out about this rule and they said, oh yeah, it's really for a good cause? And we'll talk about the practicality and the spurious argument for the cause of this regulation in a moment, surely. But if a politician were to say, oh, well, even though it's not there, it's for a good cause, could I walk into some senator's office or a congressperson's office, put my feet up on the desk and say, I am the congressman or I am the senator today? No, they would cite the Constitution and they would say, no, you're not. I would say, why not? They'd say, because it's in the Constitution. So the fact that my ability to be able to walk into an office of a congressperson and put my feet up on the desk doesn't exist in the Constitution would be something they would cite to say, no, you can't do that. But for some reason, people who are protesting this and saying you can't do that, people like me and people like so many of the others involved with their industries on the Eastern Seaboard, they can't cite exactly the same type of argument that a politician would cite if I walked into his office and said, I'm the congressman today. It's not in the Constitution. NOAA isn't in the Constitution. The control over the oceans is not in the Constitution. All that the Article 1, Section 8 provision on the oceans actually provides, and I can read it to people if they're interested, all that it actually provides is for handling felonies and crimes on the high seas. That's it. Piracies and felonies on the high seas, not speed limits. It's nuts.
Well, and the problem with all of these departments and all of these agencies and all of these things that have sort of been created over the years by the federal government, and again, it's all done under the auspices of good intentions, right? Well, we have to regulate this or we have to protect that, and it's for the people's good or it's for the environment's good, and all of these things end up getting done. And we saw, of course, and I don't want to get into this too much because it'll take us down a rabbit hole, but we saw where the path to, of good intentions leads when, under the entire COVID boondoggle and, all of the things that were done to so-called protect public health, which doesn't actually exist. And so I think one of the biggest problems here is not only is this not found in the Constitution, not only is there no constitutional basis for this, but it has real impact. I will tell you straight up, full disclosure, I am not a mariner. I got seasick watching Titanic. I don't boat. I don't boat ever. I have tried it before. It is an absolute disaster for me and for everybody else on the boat, I can assure you. I love to fish, but I do so off of a dock that stands perfectly still. So this is not my world, and I don't think that it's a lot of people's worlds, unless this is something that directly impacts you. Regulations like this end up getting passed, and nobody's any the wiser. But this particular one, it's not just that it's going to have an impact, which we'll get to in just a second. It's that it's not even realistic from a scientific and engineering perspective. So what are the experts saying that you detail in your piece?
Oh, and kudos to Fox News' Douglas Kennedy, because he has done not only from what I've seen, two video reports on this, where he did a lot of traveling too. He was in various states. He was in Washington, D.C., speaking with a congressman from Georgia. But in addition to that, he has written a lengthy written piece on this. And practically, what we're talking about is the fact that this is for boats that are between 35 feet and 60 feet long. And it will go for a 10-knot speed limit. And the commentary period lasted for 2 months last year, and now people are just waiting, wondering when the NOAA people are going to come out with this. Now, how they're going to police this, I don't know. It'll probably be through the Coast Guard, but there's really no inkling as to how they're going to do that. And so there are all sorts of problems that occur for a lot of different people. For example, people who handle just sports fishing, they know that their clients who go on day trips like to get out there rather rapidly so they can spend their time going out on the ocean and fishing. If they can't go at the rate they normally go to get their clients out there to those areas where they fish, at this would extend what would normally be an hour-long trip away from the coast to a 3-hour-long trip away from the coast at this reduced speed. And we're not talking Gilligan's Island. There's no Marianne and Ginger to entertain a guy like me out there. You're just going to be sitting there, right? So that is one thing. Then you've got the fact that for many boats, if they can't get up to speed, they actually can't navigate properly in the water. They actually have noted that they can't get to what they call a plane situation. And the plane situation, let me see if I can read this to you here. Says here, Mr. Kennedy wrote this in his Fox piece, that one of the people, a man named Chris Edmonston, who's president of Boat Owners Association of the United States, or Boat US, said that most boats can't get on a plane if they're going under 10 knots. A plane is the speed at which the bow of the boat lowers in order to cut through oncoming waves. The boats are designed to ride on top of the waves, he said. This is going to make them wallow in the waves up and down, side to side, pitching, he explained. It's going to be hard to maintain control. You can take waves over the side of the boat. They're not designed for this. This is utterly ruining investments for so many people in new boats. And I mentioned part of that in my piece, and so does Mr. Kennedy, talking about millions of dollars just for one person who's invested in a boat. And this is for people all up and down the seaboard, and not only the people who are working on the oceans, but all of the attached industries that are part of that entire industry. You've got fuelers, you've got hotelers, you've got restaurateurs. All these people are going to see a decrease in demand for their services if these guys who go out on the boats can't do their jobs the way they designed their jobs to be done. It's amazing. And of course, it all goes towards sort of Soviet central planning where, well, the government has decided that it's got to be done. And the reason that they're giving is utterly amazing too. And again, we mentioned NOAA has its reason. But even if the reason weren't as ridiculous as it is, it still would not have the constitutional or moral authority to tell other people how to do their work. They're not harming anybody. Leave them alone, you know?
Well, and that kind of does bring us to the reason, because you could sit here and you could think, why in the world would a bunch of bureaucrats, are they really so incredibly bored, which very well they might be, that they just sit there coming up with this garbage? But they always have these, again, we're protecting everybody. We're doing this for your own good, even if you don't like it, even if it harms you, it's really for your own good. The reason that NOAA is putting this regulation in place, I find very ironic, and it's all to save the whales, right? That's the reason that the government is, pushing this regulation. They can't have boats going too fast because we have to make sure that we don't kill the whales. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, the specific whale that they cite that they don't want any harm to come to is the North Atlantic right whale. So this is an endangered species. For those of you who are not brushed up on your whale news, they say that there's only about 350 of these things left in the ocean. But in your piece, and I find this interesting, you point out that the government only cites about 5 recorded instances over the past 15 years in which a boat has struck one of these whales. Now, by struck, we mean has clipped, has hit. It doesn't actually say that it dealt a fatal blow to this whale and it killed the whale, just that there was a boat-on-whale incident of some kind. Only 5 in the past 15 years that we know of. And apparently that's enough to warrant this crazy regulation that's going to affect God only knows how many industries and how many people down the line. And what I find ironic here is that this is the same exact whale, the North Atlantic right whale, that is one of several species of whale that has been found dead in recent years, having washed up on the shores of the East Coast, which is interesting. More than 30 whale carcasses have been found on East Coast beaches from Massachusetts down to Florida since last December alone, which might actually answer your question as to why New Hampshire and Vermont were not included in this new regulation, because these whales have washed up from Massachusetts down to Florida. And this is a phenomenon that environmental groups say is linked to offshore wind energy plants. And because these plants, as part of their research and their testing, they do seismic tests in the ocean. And environmental groups that have looked into where these whales are washing up on beaches, this has been happening now for a while, and it's caught a lot of groups' attention. It's caught a lot of residents' attention. You're walking down the beach and there's the carcass of a whale, and you don't see that every day. And some of these are endangered species. And they're washing up in areas that happen to be very close to these offshore wind energy plants. And so these environmental groups have claimed that there's a link. It seems that at least geographically, that seems pretty clear. Of course, these companies say that they've got nothing to do with these whale deaths. The Biden administration, which is this green energy loving, they're going to push anything environmental to score political points. They claim that there's no link, even though NOAA and the rest of the administration, they have not yet come up with any other explanation. It's a mystery. We have no idea why all these whales are washing up on shore. Maybe we'll just blame the boaters who've clipped like 5 of these things in the last decade and a half. It seems like they are reaching for anything else to blame in an effort to say, well, we're doing something, right? Because we can't blame the wind energy. We can't blame the go green energy sector because we subsidize them and we're in their back pockets anyway. And of course, the Democrats are pushing their green energy agenda. Speaking of scandals, by the way, every single year, millions of Americans just like you pay high premiums for insurance coverage that they don't need and don't use. So where does all that money go? Well, some of it goes to subsidize medical costs that you don't necessarily agree with, things like other people's abortions or gender-affirming surgeries. If you don't want your hard-earned cash going to pay for medical procedures that go against everything you believe in, you could use Share Healthcare. I'm partnering with Share Healthcare to let people know about their affordable, effective cost-sharing plans that start as low as $149 a month, helping you keep more of your money without violating your conscience. So if you're sick of paying thousands of dollars a year for health coverage you don't need, only to fund medical procedures that don't align with your values, check out sharehealthcare.com. Enter the referral code MRCTV23, that's sharehealthcare.com, referral code MRCTV23, and find a plan that saves you money today. It reminds me a little bit of when the government goes after coal mines in the United States, which burn coal about as cleanly as you can possibly burn it. They burn it cleaner than anybody else on the whole entire planet. And they go after the coal industry and they want everybody to, and they go after the oil industry. We want everybody to stop putting gasoline in their cars. So instead, we'll push battery powered cars. Oh, and by the way, pay no attention to these lithium mines over here that employ children and decimate the entire planet. You're not actually solving the problem that you say you care so much about. So that leads me, it's a long-winded setup to my question for you. I'm left here with 2 options, it seems. Either to believe that these bureaucrats are really so stupid as to not see their own ideological inconsistency, right? We don't care about the whales over here, but we care about them so much over here that we could bankrupt an entire industry. Is it truly that they don't see it and that they're that dumb? Or is there something deeper going on here?
I think there's something deeper going on, and no pun intended. It's who knows how many fathoms deep it goes. But I want to reiterate your excellent points in a couple chunks, Brittany, because what you brought up about the wind farms, absolutely key, 100% key. And I'm so glad that you thought about that. That is an awesome insight. And it's sort of like, well, you just can't go out and march against lockdowns. But if you want to go out for a BLM march, it's totally fine. It's that sort of mentality. It's that do as I say, not as I do sort of thing. And you're bringing up the lithium problem as well. These types of things are the sorts of things that should be resolved in the market. And to me, what I'm seeing here is an attempt to further exert control. And I think that was a lot of what had to do with the way that they systematized the lockdowns. In fact, the term Operation Lockstep comes to mind when we think about what we experienced over the past couple of years. And I think that as far as NOAA goes with this new speed limit, what they're doing is they're attempting to push the threshold. They're attempting to try to impose limits on what people can do, even that far out with their boats, to have more control over these people. And I think it has a lot to do with the green agenda. They're going to overlook their own messy, completely non-market oriented dictates regarding going green and trying to do their carbon capture and take people's land in the Midwest and all these different types of things to shell out money for battery power that, as you say, is seeing unbelievable runoff and dangerous problems for little kids working in these mines. And they're going to be, I think, down the line, trying to impose not just the speed limits on these boats, but other types of limits over what types of fuels they can use and all sorts of things that are going to start coming into play. And it to me, it just, if you allow the camel to get its nose under the tent a little bit, it's just the whole camel's coming through. And so one of the most important things for me is that young people seeing stories like this should not just be exposed to the practical problems that this NOAA thing is presenting and to the real world implications and burdens that this is placing on real people. That sort of pain is right out there. It's manifest, and it's sort of the top part of the story. When you can see that sort of thing, that's great. But to make sure that people understand that these types of injuries that are going to be coming for these people in so many different types of industries are coming because people don't understand the principles. They don't know the rules. They don't hold these politicians to task. They don't bring them to task for breaching their oaths to the Constitution. So the least we can do here, I think, the least that I can do, is try to take a story like this and say, look at what they're doing, look at how bad this is, and realize that even if you dodge this now, they have opened the Pandora's box, and you've got to look at how they did it. And the way they did it was by overlooking the Constitution, imposing NOAA, and imposing these restrictions that are nowhere in the very document they claim gives them power over us. And that is the source of the problem. It always is the source of the problem. So once you see that, you can backtrack and reverse engineer it to say, I know the wellspring from which this thing comes forth. And even if they can stop it now, they're going to try to do something else later. And this hypocrisy stuff and the effects on people, those are great ways to really introduce people to something that they can carry with them in the long term. Because as you and I know, regulations can come and go, and they usually come more and more and more. The impositions will come more and more and more. But the way that we can get something positive out of it is to learn that the source of these things is those people disregarding their oaths and showing us utter disrespect for the fact that they don't care what they say when they give an oath. It would be like getting married to somebody who that evening goes out and starts dating somebody else. They don't care. So that, I think, is one of the big deals about this. And perhaps there are a few people out there who do care, like Buddy Carter, that Republican congressman from Georgia. He is speaking up about this, and maybe through him, people might be able to get something done.
And that's why I wanted to have you on to talk about this. This is something that, I've got to say, it reminded me a little bit of, I have a family member who very recently, and it's kind of a humdrum routine story. Many people, homeowners, have been in the same situation. Nobody likes to have to replace their HVAC unit, right? HVAC units and water heaters are two of the worst things that you have to deal with when you're a homeowner. That or, if your roof springs a leak. And they're incredibly expensive. And I have a family member who just recently went through the rigmarole of having to buy a new one. And it wasn't even that their HVAC unit necessarily needed to be replaced, but it was going to go. It was going to go in the next year or two. And I remember her talking to her, and she saying, look, I think that the HVAC guy might be pulling one over on me, really trying to pressure me to get a new unit, because he keeps telling me that I need to get one before, this was last year, this was in 2022. I need to get one before the end of the year, because for some weird reason, all of a sudden the price of this stuff is going to go up in 2023, and he's really just putting the screws to me to get this thing done now, and I don't feel like we need one right now. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. But pushy salesmen always kind of send up a red flag. Well, I did a little bit of research. Turns out the Biden administration imposed new HVAC regulations to make them more eco-friendly, and they went into effect on January 1st of 2023, which is why the price of everything went up. And that's why this guy was trying to tell her, look, if you're going to do this, you probably need to do it now, because come 2023, we're not going to be able to get you the same old that you've had. We're going to have to get you the more expensive, regulated, Biden approved unit. And so, and that happens over and over. That happens to people all the time. And what I think ends up happening is you have these regulations. They come from the government. You have these regulations. They get imposed. Like you said, they go through this, we call it a process, but it's not really much of one. It might be a nominal one just to check off some boxes where the public is allowed to make some comment, but they don't take that into account. The regulation flows down. It ends up being enacted. It hits the industry, which then hits the individual companies, which then gets passed right along to the consumer. And you're standing there in your kitchen having to figure out how you're going to pay for this new HVAC unit, or how you're going to repair the gas stove that you can no longer get parts for because they're phasing those out. So when it comes to regulations like this, whether you're a boater, whether you have never been on the ocean, all of this stuff ends up having a trickle-down effect. And that's why we're talking about it and why it is so incredibly important. A lot of what I talk about on this show, and I maintain that it's important, and will continue to do so. A lot of what I talk about on this show are cultural and social issues. I think it's incredibly important to understand what's going on culturally and socially. I think it's incredibly important to understand and to maintain fundamental truths about basic biology and gender, to know what's happening in your kids' schools. I think that it is understandable to watch, Sam Smith gyrating in a thong on stage in front of children. I'm not at all saying that those things aren't important to talk about, but I think sometimes as conservatives, we are so understandably and rightly outraged at the bizarre, which makes sense. And I'm not saying don't do that, but we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, because these things, while we're over here watching a clip that we saw on Twitter and being outraged about it, these kinds of regulations are getting trickled through and end up impacting your wallet, and you don't even know it's happening.
It's interesting you should bring that up, Brittany, because you bring to mind two things. First, just that most recent one that you brought up. If we look at the cultural side of things, we can see that much of the culture has been undercut and corrupted by the influence of government in schools, by the influence of government and how it brings everything down to the lowest common denominator. Everybody has to be accepted. And of course, there's a cultural Marxism thing there where they're always going to bring up some new individual or small group that needs to be somehow raised up, and equity's got to be done. And of course, the government is going to determine what that equity is. And so you'll get this infusion of this sentiment within the public school system. And of course, the big moral problem with that is that somebody is going to be forced to pay for it. That's the problem from which all the other arguing and everything else stems, because everybody is seeing their tax money taken and put into this system. So maybe if people could recognize the immoral imposition of forcing other people to pay for a school system or other types of things, they could separate from these things and start to steer away from these culturally terrible things. But in addition to that, if we look at the way that the government operates, it's always done to supposedly protect people. You brought up the air conditioning thing. And these are all ways that we can start to tie into the fact that the government is harming us through the school systems, not giving people choice, and coming up with all these arguments and rationales about the environment and things like that, that we could handle ourselves just like schooling. You know, as I mentioned this now talking to you, I saw earlier today you were talking about the HVAC system, and it was today that I saw a report that I believe it was either early this morning or yesterday that the EPA just published its new hydrofluorocarbons conditions and strictures over their necessary reduction in air conditioning units. And that comes after, of course, in the 90s and early 2000s, they already imposed a ban on one type of refrigerant. So people switched over to the hydrofluorocarbons. Now they're saying that they're going to impose deeper regulations on that, even though a court ruling told them that they can't. And the way they're getting away with this is the Congress has given them permission to do this. So prior to this, the EPA was doing it through regulation. And I said, okay, the court has struck down their ability to do it through regulation. But what if Congress were to pass something like this? Would that be any more acceptable? Of course it would not. But that's what they've done. So now we've got this situation where people can say, oh, well, yeah, shouldn't the government handle that? Well, this brings us back to the oceans. And the point that I try to bring up to people is, look, if you want to protect the environment, you want to get real information. You want to find out how people value the environment. You're never going to know when politicians tell you this, because unless people can actually express their own wishes and hold their money or pay their money for whatever it might be, you're not going to know, because the politician isn't spending his own money on the environment, and he's forcing other people to spend their money or to change their lives according to what he wants. So we don't know how many whales actually exist. We don't know how many actually were killed. We're just getting information that the government is giving to us. We don't know whether we can trust that. Certainly we don't know after what we saw with all the lockdowns and the pandemic nonsense that they gave us, after Deborah Birx literally admitted in the White House certain things that we know about the numbers and how they were being inflated during the you know what. So what I think is rather important is to stress to people, if you care about the oceans, then you got to recognize that not only is government not proving that it's protecting the oceans, not showing you any real information, but you also have to rely on individuals, private property. And the only way that you can protect things like the oceans from things like trash and things like that, or potential injury from boats, is to let people have private property over the oceans. And people say, well, that sounds really theoretical. Well, think about this. I've mentioned this in pieces in the past, and I've told students in lecture halls. I said, look, one student said, yeah, straws are a problem in the ocean. So I said, how do you know they're a problem? And she stopped. It's like, because they're in the ocean, they're around fish. I'm like, yeah, but if it's a problem to whom? She said, well, I was like, it's got to be a problem to humans. We are applying some sort of value to that. But how is it we are applying a value to that? She said, well, we have to do. I was like, the only way you can know if it's a problem or it's not a problem is if someone, an individual, can choose to say, I need to apply my resources to this rather than to this. This is exigent. This is not. We all have to make decisions about where to apply our resources. And that's what we do. And the only way that we can recognize if something in the oceans is a problem is if it has a price attached to it, so that we can calculate how much it will cost to take care of that problem and how much that problem costs us. Then we can say, yeah.
I can tell you that the people that probably care the absolute most about the ocean are the boaters and the fishermen that actually utilize it. The people that care the most about the mountains are the coal miners that actually live in them. The people that care the most about the land are the farmers and the ranchers that have to work it. You're exactly right that the private industry, it not only shows where we place our value, but it also matters the most to the people that are doing the work on it. And unfortunately, what I see so often is that those tend to be the first people people that are penalized by these regulations, by people sitting in some marble-halled building leagues away who have absolutely no expertise in this whatsoever, but get to make the rules, and they do it on our tax dime. You know, and you're right. And it happens all the time. It might not make for the sexiest headline all the time. It might not make for the most flamboyant story. It definitely might not make for a 15-second soundbite on Twitter, but it's incredibly important to pay attention to stories like this, because this is what the government does. This is what a government does when it is allowed to run out of control, when it is allowed to continually add on departments and agencies, when it gets so bloated and it takes so much money and it is so expensive and it has got its hands in so many things that it becomes impossible for the average person to keep up with all of the stuff that gets, you know, just pushed through like this every single day. So it'll be interesting to see. I want to stay on top of this. I want to have you back on to talk about more regulations and stuff like this. I do think that one of the things that you brought up is, how do people know about this? Well, they know because you write it. They know because we publish it on MRC-TV. And they also know it because MRC actively pushes back on censorship, which is always a problem. This video may or may not actually end up on YouTube. I don't know if we said anything that's going to trigger their red flags. We get booted off of YouTube a lot. So if you are watching this on YouTube, then awesome. But if not, always make sure that you head on over to Rumble and subscribe to MRC TV over on Rumble, because that's where you're going to find the vast majority of our content when we get kicked off of other platforms. With that, again, thank you so much for being with me, Gard. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brittany. And yes, I know as I went through some of those things, I thought, oh man, YouTube's not going to like that one. And I'll just stress to people, if they want to look into management of the oceans and things like that through private property, one of the key things is, if you allow private property to exist, then people who own the private property can sue if they've got damage. And this is something that the government tends to avoid, and oftentimes will cause all sorts of problems for people if they actually want to bring some sort of a damage suit against the government. It's very difficult to do that. With private property, people actually can work things out and achieve a much better balance over these things. And you can actually get real information. You can try to prove something in court. The government, I don't believe the government half the time, 99% of the time.
You believe the government half the time? I know you a little bit better than that.
Yeah, good call.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Make sure you head over to Apple Podcasts, hit subscribe on The Brittany Hughes Show. That way you won't ever miss an episode. Also, subscribe to the Newsbusters podcast. That one's on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. With that, I will see you guys back here next Thursday. Have a blessed weekend.